Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, how much time do I have? I understand it might be 10 or 15 minutes.
Time is not controlled, Senator.
So I have 10 or 15 minutes minimally. Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak about amendment number 2083 that I'm offering to the bill that's before us. I think all of us know the U.S. Postal Service is absolutely not sustainable in its current form. Mail volume has greatly declined over the past decade and will continue to decline over the next decade. The United States Post Office has known this for a long time. They knew that mail volume was declining and that the market for their products was changing. But the economic crisis made things far worse than they could have imagined. And now the United States Post Office is on the edge of financial ruin. But we didn't get here only because of the economic crisis. It's because the U.S. Postal Service's business model is fundamentally broken. The USPS lost $5.1 billion in this last fiscal year and $3.3 billion in the first quarter of this current year. I know that some have tried to blame the requirement that the USPS pre-fund their retirement health benefits for the USPS financial losses, but the fact is that these recent losses are not, and let me underline, not due to the pre-funding requirement, because Congress has allowed the USPS to delay this last year's payment. The United States Post Office has also nearly reached their statutory borrowing limit. Faced with this situation, it is abundantly clear that the USPS must make radical changes in its existing infrastructure and business model. And again, Mr. President, USPS should have, could have, and indeed has wanted to begin making these changes to its outdated, excessive infrastructure, but Congress, all of us here, or at least some of us here, have blocked these attempts. We should give the USPS the flexibility to meet these challenges and make business decisions on how to deal with the paradigm shift in their primary market rather than further limiting their ability to adapt. My amendment to S. 1789 gives the U.S. Post Office greater flexibility in three primary areas: facilities and service, pricing, and labor. On the facilities and service, it allows the United States Post Office to continue closing post offices using the existing procedures for post office closures. They already exist. Instead of creating further barriers to closures, which this bill does. These procedures are well thought out and give ample opportunities for public comment and appeals. It also allows the Post Office to proceed with their proposed change in delivery service standards, something they have proposed, a key component to their 5-year plan of profitability. This amendment also allows the Post Office to immediately implement 5-day delivery if it chooses, a move that the U.S. Post Office believes may save nearly $2 billion a year. The underlying bill, on the other hand, requires a 2-year delay in further study of this issue which the Post Office already knows needs to happen. Mr. President, we don't need a study to tell us what we already know. The Post Office needs flexibility in its delivery schedule, and a number of interested parties, including the Post Office and the President, support moving to a 5-day delivery. Furthermore, my amendment allows the Post Office to close processing and distribution centers, something the Post Office has identified as needed action for nearly a decade. On pricing, my amendment removes the arbitrary CPI-based cap put in place by the 2006 Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. Put simply, this gives the Post Office more flexibility to adjust their prices as markets change. Current law and 1789 actually mandates that the Post Office provide some services at a loss. it is unbelievable the calls we've been receiving in our office that basically point to the tremendous corporate welfare that is in existence. People calling me not want these changes because it affects their business. A congressional mandate at the U.S. Post Office provides certain services. It mandates that the Post Office provide certain services without covering their cost, and that makes very little sense. Please note, Mr. President, that this would not allow the Post Office to arbitrarily raise rates at will. They would still be subject to the Postal Regulatory Commission, the PRC regulation. Finally, on labor, my amendment gives the Post Office greater flexibility to reduce its workforce as needed and negotiate contracts that make sense for its financial situation. Since labor costs make up approximately 80% of the Post Office's cost structure, it is clear that any good faith postal reform proposal must include labor reform. First, it prohibits the inclusion of a no layoff clause. Let me underline this, in the future. This doesn't change in the future, in future collective bargaining agreements. It does not alter CBAs currently in place that contain these clauses. This is only for future clauses. As mail volume continues to decline, the Post Office must have the flexibility to change the size and makeup of its workforce as needed. Second, this amendment eliminates a provision in existing law that requires fringe benefits for Post Office employees be at least as good as those that existed in 1971. These benefits represent a huge portion of fixed labor costs, which currently place a major burden on Post Office operations. Eliminating this provision will give the Post Office more options in contract negotiation rather than hamstringing them. So, Mr. President, my amendment is a balanced approach that strives to give the U.S. Post Office maximum flexibility in multiple areas as they work towards financial stability. And here's the best part, Mr. President. According to CBO, which just contacted us today, this bill saves $21 billion over the next decade. Let me say that one more time. CBO has just contacted us. Here the Post Office is in tremendous financial straits. We have a bill before us that hamstrings them and keeps them from doing the things that we all know, if this were our real business, we would allow to happen. Our bill, obviously, our amendment, gives them the flexibility to do the things that the Post Office needs to do and that most every American understands that they need to do, and this amendment saves our nation $21 billion over the next 10 years. Unfortunately, by the way, this $21 billion is not enough to fully offset the cost of this bill. It is my understanding, by the way, there's no attempt to offset the cost of this bill over the next 10 years. So in conclusion, Mr. President, it's clear that the United States Post Office must make drastic changes. And I applaud those portions of 1789 that allow the USPS greater flexibility. But there are far too many provisions in the underlying bill, Senate 1789, that would put more restrictions on the United States Post Office, not fewer, and limit the organization's ability to adapt to changing times. I urge support of my amendment. Mr. President, I thank you for the time, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akanga.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it pains me greatly to disagree with my friend and colleague from Tennessee, with whom I have a great friendship and great respect. But what he is essentially offering comes pretty close to a complete substitute for the provisions in our bill. And I want to go through the provisions to make sure that our colleagues understand fully what the choices are that are presented by Senator Corker's amendment. First, let me say that I do strongly oppose his amendment because of the impact that I believe it would have on postal customers, whether they're in rural America, whether they're a big mailer, a small mailer, a residence, a business, and what the impact ultimately will be on postal revenue. Let's first discuss the issue of six-day delivery. Now, there are a lot of different views on this issue. Senator Corker has presented one, as has Senator McCain, of moving immediately to five-day delivery. On the other hand, there are members who have filed amendments who want to prevent the Postal Service from ever moving to five-day delivery. Here is what is in our bill. Our bill recognizes that the Postal Service should, if possible, avoid deep cuts in its service, and certainly eliminating one day a week of delivery is a deep cut in the service that it is providing. It recognizes, however, that if the Postal Service cannot wring out the excessive cost that is in its current system, that it may have no choice but to eliminate Saturday delivery in order to become solvent. So what we do is allow a two-year period during which time the Postal Service would implement the many cost savings provisions that are in our bill, including a workforce reduction of 18%. That's about 100,000 employees through compassionate means such as buyouts and retirement incentives, and then have the GAO and the PRC, the Postal Regulatory Commission, certify that despite undertaking all of these cost-saving moves, it is not possible for the Postal Service to return to solvency without this deep service cut. But to move immediately to eliminating Saturday delivery would come at a real cost, and it may not be necessary. It may not be necessary at all. I would also point out that the experts in this area are the members of the Postal Regulatory Commission. The experts are not at CBO. The experts are the regulators of the Postal Service, the PRC. And when the PRC examined the issue of eliminating Saturday delivery, here's what it found. First of all, it found that the potential savings were far less than the Postal Service estimated. In fact, that they were half as much as the Postal Service estimated. Second, they found that eliminating Saturday delivery put rural America in particular at a disadvantage because rural America often does not have access to broadband, to Internet services, and to alternative delivery systems. So that the PRC, which looked at this issue very carefully and issued a report, found that the savings were less by half and that the consequences were far more severe for rural America. Saturday delivery also gives the Postal Service itself a competitive advantage over non-postal alternatives. If we're here trying to save the Postal Service, why would we jeopardize an asset that the Postal Service has that its competitors do not? And that's why we came up with this carefully crafted compromise on this issue. I believe that cutting Saturday delivery should be the last resort, not the first option, because it will inevitably drive away customers. That's one reason the American Newspaper Association is so opposed to doing away with Saturday delivery. It is one reason that many of the mail-order pharmaceutical companies are so opposed to this, because many seniors depend on receiving their vital medications through the mail. But again, we have said that if there are no other alternatives, this measure could proceed. But I can't imagine any large business operating this way, cutting service first. My colleagues often talk about how important it is to let the Postal Service act like a, quote, real business. But this is the last thing a real business would do. Real businesses know that their most valuable asset is their customer base. Businesses do literally everything else before slashing service and raising prices or anything else that might alienate or drive away their remaining customers. And they don't do this out of the goodness of their heart, but because they understand what drives their bottom line. The fact is that if more customers leave the Postal Service, the revenue will plummet. So again, reducing service, eliminating Saturday delivery should be the last resort, not the first option, and that is exactly what our bill does. The Senator's amendment would also repeal the CPI link to postal rates. I am at a loss as to why the Senator would propose that. Eliminating that protection, that orderly system, would be devastating for many mailers. And again, mailers need predictable, steady, stable rates. Think of a catalog company that prints its catalog so many months in advance. It now can count on what the postal rates are going to be. Under the Senator from Tennessee's amendment, that stability, that predictability would be gone. The reason in 2006 that we rewrote the rate-setting system was that it had been an extremely litigious, time-consuming system. Both the mailers and the Postal Service hated the system that we had prior to 2006. Both agreed at the time that it was important to have stability, predictability in rates, and to have a system that didn't involve this very expensive, litigious rate-setting system. So we went to the CPI-linked system so that we could have stable, predictable, and transparent pricing increases. This amendment repeals the section of the current law on rate setting that mailers have repeatedly testified is the heart of the 2006 reforms and something that they need if they are continue to use the Postal Service. And that's why the Mailers, the largest customers of the Postal Service, are such strong supporters of the predictable system that we put in place in 2006. Let me turn to another issue. There's so much I could say on all of these, but I can see a lot of members have come to the floor. The senator's amendment would also eliminate the standards that we put into the bill to protect overnight delivery within certain delivery areas. We have recently learned that the Postal Service's own preliminary analysis, submitted confidentially in secret to its regulators at the PRC, reveals that its service reduction plan to slow mail delivery, shut down postal plants, will lead to more than a 9% decrease in first-class mail and a 7.7% reduction in all classes of mail. The Postal Service, in this preliminary estimate, said that the first-year losses alone would be $5.2 billion that the Postal Service would lose if we proceed with this plan. And now that those numbers have become public, the Postal Service is backpedaling and criticizing its own estimates, but those are the estimates that are in its own survey that was filed with the PRC. And they don't surprise me because they're consistent with what I'm hearing from major postal customers. And once those customers turn to other communications options and leave the mail system, they will not be coming back, revenue will plummet, and the Postal Service will be sucked further into a death spiral. Now, there are many other comments that I could make about the amendment offered by the senator from Tennessee. Let me say that I think his amendment essentially constitutes a substitute to the bill that is before us, in that it makes so many fundamental changes. I believe that it would be devastating for the Postal Service, that it would cause large and small mailers to leave the Postal Service, setting off the spiral of the death spiral from which the Postal Service might never recover. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Tennessee.
20 seconds, not to rebut anything that's been said. I think the senator from Maine and I have a very different view about the way to solve the post office issues, but I just want to thank her for her tone. And I want to thank the senator from Connecticut, too, for the way that they continue to work together to try to produce legislation in this body. So I thank them both for being the way they are. They're two of my most admired senators that I admire most here. I thank them. I have a very different point of view on this issue, but I thank them for the way they continually work together to try to solve problems, and I look forward to continuing to work with them on this issue.
The senator from Connecticut.
I know there are others on the floor who want to speak. I just want to say briefly thanks to my friend from Tennessee, not just for his kind words, which mean a lot to me, but for coming to the floor to discuss his amendment. There are different points of view about this, and I think, as I said very simplistically at the beginning of the debate, some think that our bipartisan committee bill does too little, some think it does too much. I think we've hit the right common ground spot, and I repeat again what I said earlier in the day. There is some due process in this. We don't allow for what might be called shock therapy for the Postal Service because we don't think it'll work, and we think it would have the net effect of diminishing the revenues of the Postal Service by cutting business. But Here's the report that we got today from the U.S. Postal Service itself. So just to indicate to my friend from Tennessee and to others who may be following the debate, this substitute bill of ours, 1789, is not just fluff. The Postal Service itself estimates that over the coming 3 years, that is by 2016 fiscal year, our bill, if enacted, will enable the Postal Service to save $19 billion annually. They were hoping for $20 billion, but $19 billion is pretty close. And I think we've done it without the dislocations to the millions of people in our society who depend on the mail and depend on mailing industries for their jobs, as well as the hundreds of thousands of people who work for the Postal Service, 18% of whom we hope will receive incentives that will be adequate for them to think about retirement. But this is a bill that creates a transition that will keep the Postal Service alive, and we think even healthier, without the kind of jolts, sudden jolts that the amendment offered by my friend from Tennessee would provide. So, or would impose. So I would respectfully oppose the Corker amendment. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, before I discuss my pending amendment to the postal reform bill, I would like to take a moment to honor 4 brave soldiers based out of Schofield Barracks from Hawaii who died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan on Thursday. They made the ultimate sacrifice in service to our country, and we will never forget them. My thoughts and prayers, and I know those of many others in Hawaii and others across the United States, are with their families tonight. And we honor and thank them and are so sorry for their loss. Mr. President, I rise to discuss my Amendment 2034 regarding federal workers' compensation, which is co-sponsored by 9 senators, including Senators Inouye, Harkin, Murray, Franken, Leahy, Shaheen, Kerry, Lautenberg, and Brown of Ohio. I have serious concerns with the provisions of the postal reform bill that would make changes to the federal workers' compensation program known as FECA, not just within the Postal Service, but across the entire government. These provisions would cut benefits to elderly disabled employees and eliminate a supplement for dependents. Many who are already injured have their benefits cut retroactively. This is particularly unfair because most employees affected by these far-reaching cuts are not even postal employees. Many are Defense and State Department employees injured supporting missions overseas, federal law enforcement officers and firefighters injured saving lives, or prison guards attacked by inmates. The sponsors of this bill argue that changes to workers' compensation must be included in this legislation to place the Postal Service on a sound financial footing. However, the fact is that the changes would have very little effect on the Postal Service's deficit. According to the Congressional Budget Office, these changes would actually cost the Postal Service an additional $21 million in the first 3 years. Any changes to benefits for those injured in service to the country should be done in a careful, comprehensive manner. There are complex issues that deserve more analysis before we simply cut benefits people have planned for and depend on. At a hearing I held last July, witnesses raised serious concerns with reducing FICA benefits, especially at the retirement age. They testified that disabled employees may not be able to save enough in time for a reduction in income because they missed out on wage growth, Social Security, and the thrift savings plan. Because of this disadvantage, the federal government, like most states, provides benefits that last as long as the injury, even if that is past the normal retirement age. At the request of a bipartisan group of members from the House Committee on Education and Workforce, the Government Accountability Office is currently reviewing both pre- and post-retirement age FICA benefits to determine fair benefit amounts. Acting on this proposal now, without waiting for GAO's analysis, is irresponsible. As a result, we may set benefit levels too low, seriously harming disabled employees, or too high, taking funding away from other priorities. We must be extremely cautious not to make arbitrary cuts to benefits that could have serious detrimental effects on elderly disabled employees. Last November, the House passed a Republican-led bipartisan FICA reform bill, H.R. 2465, by a voice vote. The bipartisan sponsors of this bill chose not to make any changes to benefits without more information on appropriate benefit levels. I believe their actions were correct, and the Senate should enact similar legislation by passing my amendment. My amendment would strike the government-wide FICA provisions in this bill and replace them with the House-passed FICA reform bill, which makes a number of common-sense reforms that will improve program efficiency and integrity without reducing benefits. Among other things, my amendment contains program integrity measures recommended by the Inspector General at the Department of Labor, the Accountability Office, and the administration that will save taxpayers money. My amendment would also update benefit levels for funeral costs and disfigurement that have not been increased since 1949. And it would protect civilian employees serving in dangerous areas such as Iraq and Afghanistan by giving them more time to file a claim and making sure injuries from terrorism are covered even if the employee is off duty. Everyone understands that the Postal Service is in the midst of a serious financial crisis that must be addressed. And Chairman Lieberman and Ranking Member Collins have done a great job in bringing this on. However, breaking our promises to injured federal employees to save the Postal Service just as a tiny fraction of its deficit, I believe is wrong. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. I yield back my time.
President.
The Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I have the greatest respect for the senator from Hawaii. I know that he cares deeply about this issue, but it is simply time for us to reform the federal workers' compensation program for postal workers and for other federal workers. And for this reason, I oppose his amendment because it does not begin to solve the problems that have been repeatedly documented in the program by the inspectors general at the Postal Service, at the Department of Labor, by GAO, and by the Obama administration, which has called for many of the reforms that we have incorporated into this bill. Senator Akaka's amendment takes on only very minor reforms which are already included in the bill. It does not even attempt to constrain the rapidly growing costs of the program, and it truly does nothing to effectively combat the fraud in the program. Let me start with some background to show you the escalating costs of the federal workers' compensation system. From 1997 to 2009, the program's costs grew by an astonishing $1 billion, as this chart shows. That was a 52% increase in program expenditures. It's one of the reasons why President Obama's administration has submitted changes to this program over and over again. Our bill, according to the CBO, would reduce the program's outlays for workers' comp by $1.2 billion over the next 10 years. I would note that the Obama administration supports across-the-board reforms, just as we put in our bill. It makes no sense to have one system for postal workers and one system for federal employees when they all participate in the same program now. The Postal Service, however, makes up more than 40% of all workers' comp cases for the government, and the number of postal employees on the long-term rolls has increased by 62% since 2003. With paying more than $1 billion a year in workers' comp payments, the Postal Service is the largest program participant, providing over a third of the program's budget. And these changes are supported by the leaders at the Postal Service. The amendment would block desperately needed reforms to a program that has not been updated in over 35 years. Now, let me talk a little bit about the structure of benefits in the program and why there is a problem. Under the current program, a worker who has dependents and is out on workers' comp receives a payment at the rate of 75% of his pre-injury salary, and these benefits are tax-free. Currently, more than 70% of beneficiaries are receiving compensation at that level. In addition to that, it's important to understand that that 75% tax-free benefit rate is higher than that paid by any comparable state workers' compensation system. And given our current tax code, 75% of salary tax-free is equivalent for most people to a full salary after taxes. Now, we do want to make sure that we have a workers' comp program that takes care of our injured workers, that is compassionate, that helps them recover and return to work. But the current program in the federal government does not accomplish those roles. First of all, it does not encourage injured workers to get the help that they need to recover and to return to work, as these statistics will demonstrate. Right now, the program across the board, federal and postal workers, has 10,000 beneficiaries aged 70 or older, 2,000 of whom are postal employees. They're receiving higher payments on workers' comp than they would under the standard retirement program. That's almost a quarter of all beneficiaries in the program who are over age 70. Of the workers, of the beneficiaries, 430 of them are over age 90, and 6 of the workers' comp beneficiaries are age 100 or older. Mr. President, these employees are not going back to work. If they were still working, it would be a miracle. They'd be retired. And it is not fair to postal and federal employees who work their entire lives, retire at age 60 or 65, and receive a retirement benefit that is 26% lower than the median benefit received by workers' compensation recipients. That is just unfair. That means that people who remain on workers' comp make more money than if they had continued working, and much more than they would make in the retirement systems for federal and postal workers. Now, Mr. President, I want to make sure that as we've reformed this system, and one of the major reforms is to move people at age 65 from workers' comp to the normal retirement system. But we have exempted from these reforms those who are least able to prepare for it, those who are totally disabled and unable to return to work, and those who are age 65 and over. And I think that that is a very fair approach. Another protection that we've included for those current claimants who would be affected by the reforms in the bill is a 3-year waiting period. If a claimant is not already grandfathered and therefore is not disabled and unable to return to work, then that individual would experience no reduction in benefits for 3 years, regardless of that individual's age. Again, the reforms that we've included in our bill closely track the reforms proposed by President Obama's administration. Finally, let me just say this program has proven to be highly vulnerable to fraud. GAO reported as recently as November that the vulnerabilities in the program increase the risk of claimants receiving benefits that they're not entitled to. There are many reasons for that. I'll go into that further at another time. But the Department of Labor Inspector General reported that the removal of a single fraudulent claim saves on average between $300,000 and $500,000. What's more, These vulnerabilities are not new and they are not rare. When the IG looked at 10,000 claimant files a decade ago, there were irregularities in almost 75% of them, and it resulted in benefits being reduced or ended for more than 500 claimants. So, Mr. President, this is a troubled program. It needs to be reformed. It needs to be made fairer. It needs to be fairer to injured workers. There needs to be more of a focus on return to work, and it needs to be fairer to workers who spend their entire careers working for the Postal Service or the federal government and then retire and receive a far lower benefit than an elderly individual who remains on workers' comp. Thank you, Mr. President. I urge the defeat of the amendment.
Mr. President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I would like to address a number of statements that my good friend, Senator Collins, has made about the FECA provisions in this bill. First, it has been argued that these changes are necessary to save the Postal Service money. However, since most employees affected by these cuts are not postal employees, the savings expected from these changes would have very little effect on the Postal Service's deficit. In fact, according to the CBO, these changes would actually cost the Postal Service an additional $21 million in the first 3 years. In addition, it has been said that the floor, the FECA recipients over retirement age get 26% more income than similar employees who work their entire career and retire under the normal retirement systems. This statistic comes from a recent GAO report that looked at only a small sample of non-postal workers eligible for CSRS retirement. In fact, according to GAO, their recent report only examines 8% of the active federal workforce and does not even look at the Postal Service workers. Cuts should not be made to FECA benefits until GAO completes a more comprehensive study now underway which examines the impact of benefit reductions on first participants. The Senate has not considered FECA legislation since 2006, and the only hearing was the one I held last year. The Federal Workers' Comp Program, like most state programs, allows injured workers to continue receiving compensation as long as the injury lasts, even if that is past normal retirement age. This is necessary because disabled workers on FECA don't earn Social Security credit and cannot participate in the thrift savings plan, and they miss out on normal wage growth. We must make them whole for their injuries by making up for lost wages and the inability to save for retirement. It is simply not the case that workers over retirement age who still receive FECA benefits are somehow scamming the system. In fact, in 1974, Congress repealed.
The senators notified we're under a previous order to move to executive session at 5 p.m. Does the senator seek more time to conclude his remarks?
Yes. Let me wrap up here.
Without objection.
Yeah. In fact, in 1974, Congress repealed an earlier statute to allow a reduction at age 70. Congress cited concerns about the hardship the reductions caused on senior citizens, as well as concerns about age discrimination when repealing the past, less severe version of this legislation. No matter a person's age, they have every right to that benefit. I want to say, Mr. President, that the chairman of our committee, Joe Lieberman, and the ranking member has worked hard at this, and my whole effort here is to deal with many of the workers of the federal government who are not in postal services as well, and ask that my amendment be considered. Thank you very much.
President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I wonder if I could ask unanimous consent for just 3 moments on this amendment.
Without objection.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, I want to thank Senator Akaka for coming to the floor and speaking on behalf of his amendment. He's just one of the most hardworking, constructive members of our committee, the committee from which the underlying bill has come. He's one of the finest people I've ever met. I have just the greatest admiration and affection for him. So, like Senator Collins, it's with some reluctance that I must say I oppose this amendment. I want to just be very brief because Senator Collins has spoken well on it. I think the current system goes beyond really taking care of those who need workers' compensation, and it's come to a point where it is unfair, not just to those who are paying for the system, but to others who are working in the Postal Service today. And I do think that, I thank Senator Collins. She's worked very hard on this, very thoughtfully. The proposal she made turned out to be so balanced and constructive that folks in the Obama administration who had been working on a similar proposal for all federal employees asked that we extend the workers' compensation reforms in the Postal Service bill to all federal employees. Dare I call this a Collins-Obama proposal? I don't know. I just raised that prospect. In any case, I support the underlying bill in this regard and very respectfully and affectionately oppose the Akaka amendment. I yield the floor, and I thank the chair.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will now report.
Nomination, the judiciary, Brian C. Wimes of Missouri to be United States District Judge for the Eastern and Western Districts of Missouri.
Under the previous order, there will now be 30 minutes for debate, equally divided in the usual form.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I see the distinguished senator from Missouri on the floor, Senator Blunt. I know that he has a Republican leadership meeting to get to. Why don't I yield such time as he needs out of the Republican reserve time, and with the understanding that when he finishes, it'll go back to me.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I thank my good friend for...
The senator from Missouri.
I thank my good friend for yielding and for taking consideration of my schedule, and I rise to support Judge Brian Wimes as the nominee for the Eastern and Western Districts of Missouri. He's spent his entire career working in the public sector. He's been involved in many groups and organizations dedicated to serving disadvantaged individuals. He was born in Kansas City, Missouri. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Kansas. We don't hold that against him. He got his law degree from the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University in 1994. When he graduated, he became the attorney advisor for the litigation branch of the Federal Bureau of Prisons in the Department of Justice here in Washington, and Judge Wimes represented the Bureau in civil actions by inmates throughout the country. In 1995, he left the Bureau and became an assistant prosecuting attorney for the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office in Kansas City. Beginning in 2001, Judge Wimes served as the Jackson County Drug Court Commissioner for more than 5 years. The drug courts in our state and in other places have served a good and integral role in combating drug abuse. The drug court's a program that offers nonviolent first-time offenders a chance to participate in an outpatient-based treatment program rather than to face prosecution, and more than 1,200 people have graduated from the Jackson County Drug Court. More than 96% of those people were conviction-free after 5 years from their graduation. As a prosecutor, Judge Wimes received national honors, including he was named Rookie Prosecutor of the Year during his first time in his first year in the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office. In 2002, he was honored as a member of Ingram's Magazine's 40 Under 40. In 2009, the Call newspaper recognized him as one of the 25 most influential African Americans in Kansas City. He's been deeply involved in Big Brothers and Big Sisters and the Hope House Domestic Violence Shelter. He's a member of Aunt Monica's Catholic Church. In 2007, Judge Wimes was appointed by my son, Governor Matt Blunt, to serve on the 16th Judicial Circuit Court of Jackson County, Missouri, and if Matt Blunt made any mistakes as governor, this wasn't one of them. Judge Wimes has continued not only to serve on the court, but to serve on boards in Kansas City for the Kansas City Youth Court, which is affiliated with the UMKC School of Law, as well as the Criminal Justice Advisory Board of the Penn Valley Community College in Kansas City, the Mental Health Association of the Heartland. I believe his experience makes him a highly qualified judicial nominee, and he will serve the American people well in this job, and I am supportive of him, Mr. President. And, Mr. President, I have a statement on another matter that I also mentioned to my friend from Vermont that I would make while I was here, and I'd ask that it appear separately in the record.
Without objection.
I want to talk for just a few minutes, Mr. President, about Chuck Colson, who was a friend of mine and the founder of Prison Fellowship. He died on Saturday at 80. Before Chuck Colson was 40, he was a counselor to the President of the United States, Richard Nixon. At about that same time, about the time he was 40, he pled guilty to offenses related to the Daniel Ellsberg break-in. And when he did that, I'm told, even though his lawyers advised him not to plead guilty at that moment, he said the pleading guilty was quote, the price I had to pay to complete the shedding of my old life to be free to live the new life. In June of 1974, he began to serve his prison sentence. And what was the new life? In August of 1973, Chuck Colson's good friend Tom Phillips had counseled with him, and that was the moment that Chuck Colson said he decided that his life would be led as a Christian, that he'd surrendered his life to the Christian view, to the Christian belief. He told me personally at one time that it was T.S. Eliot's writings, Mere Christianity, that then later became the intellectual basis for his faith. But his faith initially was he needed more than he clearly understood he had, and he found that in his faith. It was an active faith. Mr. President, I'm constantly amazed that an active God can take the bad decisions that people make, and while God wouldn't have wanted those to be the decisions people make, can really turn them into incredible opportunities. In the life of Chuck Colson, that incredible opportunity became the founding of Prison Fellowship and the impact it had on so many other lives. 20 years ago, I became the first chairman of Missouri Prison Fellowship as Chuck Colson was reaching out, trying to see how this idea could become an idea that would sustain itself perhaps in the future within states. 10 years ago, I hosted as a House member a series of a speakers series that was the Chuck Colson Speakers Series, and was able to spend time with him virtually every week for 2 or 3 months as we had people come in and visit with House members in a great speakers series. I personally benefited from lots of advice and discussions with him. And just to sum up a couple of things about him as I reach a conclusion here that doesn't begin to express the impact he had on people's lives. He founded Christian Fellowship Ministries in 1976. He founded Justice Fellowship in 1983. They have both grown to serve literally thousands of prisoners in this country and around the world. Prisons around the world saw Chuck Colson walk into them as well to try to help people. In 1993, he won the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion, and in 1994, he was instrumental in drafting the publication and publishing a document called Evangelicals and Catholics Together. In 2008, he was awarded the Presidential Citizen Medal by President George W. Bush, and he's survived by a family that cared about him and lots of friends. And I'd say, Mr. President, for almost 40 years, starting with a Mike Wallace interview, as I suppose only Mike Wallace could interview someone, there were doubters and skeptics who questioned his faith, who questioned his change in his life beginning in 1973, but of course they questioned it less so every year. And I would say here in 2012 that Chuck Colson passed any test about who he had become. The test is both passed, and P-A-S-S-E-T and P-A-S-T is passed and passed. The race is won. Lives continue to be changed. And I would just say, Mr. President, I thank God for Chuck Colson, and I thank my good friend from Vermont for giving me a few moments here on the floor.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, retaining or gaining